Have you ever had that little feeling that, you really shouldn't do something, but you just can't help yourself? That about sums up my experience making the recent Jeff the Killer video. Much like the Future Wet Dry World video, my thoughts on this character have been eating at me for a while now. This was one of those video topics where I didn't really care about how my opinions would be received. I've taken bigger L's before, and it was something that I felt I had to put out into the ether in order to get some peace of mind. So you can probably imagine how surprised I was to see everyone's reception towards it. Like, I was expecting this thing to be about as divisive as my Yu-Gi-Oh content. If not more so, considering it's Jeff the fucking Killer. But all of that aside, I really cannot put into words how good it feels to have finally made a video again that a lot of people enjoy. I haven't really been able to do that since the Hungry Burger video, and part of me was a little worried that I still didn't have it in me. I want to take this moment to thank you all for your kind words and feedback. It really means a lot. With that all being said, there were still a few things I either missed or didn't do a great job of articulating in that video. So for completion's sake, I'll be addressing the rest of those points in this video. You can consider this as a brief follow-up to that project before I move on to whatever I do next. First thing on the docket is my critique of the Banning Case stories. I probably should have done a better job in my video of explaining my criticism towards them, because believe it or not, I didn't hate those stories. Okay, maybe I thought the 2015 story was overrated, but still. While I did lose interest in this series after a certain point, I'd be lying if I said that I hated the first few sequels. I already expressed that I liked what those stories did with Jane and Randy, and while I did call Jeff's cult of personality patently absurd in my video, which it is, don't get it twisted, it was still an enjoyable aspect of those stories and something that I was able to suspend my disbelief towards. The only real beef I have with the Banning Case stories is that Jeff gets sidelined after a certain point. I get that might have been the point of those stories since they spent a lot of time building Jeff up into this larger-than-life character, but they constantly tease the idea that he'll eventually show up again, and he just never does. This, coupled with the fact that the later stories were starting to lose focus, just rubbed me the wrong way after a certain point. I think that for a series claiming to be a proper reboot of the character, it failed at its job, which segues into the other reason why I'm making this follow-up video. To put it bluntly, I missed some rather notable projects that occurred after the 2015 reboot. This was due to the fact that I didn't really keep up with the ongoings of the creepypasta community after 2017, so I was under the impression that the characters' stories have just been irrelevant in recent years. And while I think that assessment is correct to some extent, it neglects one major exception. The main subject of this video that I want to discuss is the Morgue Files and its character Jeffrey Mason, but before I give my thoughts on it, I want to provide my input on a few other projects first. This video isn't going to cover the Jeffrey Keaton stories. I've watched a bit of Needles and Smiles and it just isn't for me. I would have probably loved watching these back when I was in high school, but they aren't what I'm currently looking for in a Jeff the Killer story. The projects that I do want to cover real quick are Jeff the Killer Reborn by Random Phyre, Jeff the Killer Repaired by VibingLeaf, and the recent 2-hour reboot of Jeff the Killer by Postra. The first two are rather short projects, and they each have completely different goals. VibingLeaf's video is designed to be a short screamer video, which is why I didn't find it necessary to discuss in my essay, and it more or less succeeds at what it's trying to do. I personally didn't find this video scary, but the production quality behind it is great and Jeff's design is quite eerie. Phyre's video, on the other hand, is designed to emulate an old Windows Movie Maker video, and while I thought the ending broke that immersion, it otherwise felt pretty authentic. Honestly, I'm surprised that this video only has 800 views. Everything from the song choices and the sudden shift in tone is done pretty well. If you enjoy retro horror projects, or if you're wanting to make your own video with Jeff the Killer, I would check both of these out so you can see what's been done so far with the character. There's not a whole lot to critique with these two since they're both just these short, fun projects designed to get a quick scare at the viewer. The same cannot be said, however, for the Postra remake. Since my goal usually when analyzing a fictional work is to try and deconstruct it so that I can apply its ideas or techniques to my own writing, I'll mostly be focusing on what really stuck out to me and why I thought it was good or bad. I wouldn't treat this review as a full objective analysis. This isn't a Mauler video, and I want to get this out in a timely manner. I do want to preface that I did enjoy Postra's story, I just think that there's areas that could have been improved. The first thing that really sticks out to me is that the story is very loose with adhering to realism. I figure this was probably an artistic choice. I mean, I'd be shocked if Postra wrote this story without taking his own art style into consideration. Personally, I think he should have made this story into a comic or something if he was going to go this route, but putting that aside, this does open up a few plot holes and contrivances in the story. An example that immediately comes to mind due to this choice is the lack of standard procedure from law enforcement in the story. I get that Postra wanted to do a collection of short stories in the form of different encounters before building up to Lou and digging into Jeff's past, but this could have been done without breaking the reader's immersion. It probably would have been more believable if the officers had sought out Bruce McDonald as part of their investigation into Jay Douglas's murder before following breadcrumbs that Jeff had planted as part of his plan. Not only that, but it would have given the story a more stable structure leading up to the officers' meetup with Lou, since they would have made the connection between the witnesses naturally as part of their investigation. Not to mention that the illusion of falling down a rabbit hole sounds very on brand for a classic Jeff the Killer's story. Instead, what we got was a collection of short stories facilitated due to a hunch from one of the officers, and then suddenly we're told that we need to go see Lou because one of the suspects mentioned the Woods family massacre in their account. It's just a very abrupt change in the direction of the story with very little build-up, and the reasons for it playing out like this feel incredibly artificial. Another thing that sticks out to me is the overall tone and atmosphere of the story. The biggest piece of praise that I want to give towards Postra is that he succeeded in emulating the feel of classic creepypasta. Despite the flaws that this story has, I definitely felt like my teenage self again. Part of it could have been the music selection in his video, part of it could have been the choice of voice actors, part of it could have been the amount of time that went into repeatedly describing Jeff's abhorrent appearance, or part of it could have just been that Postra turned Randy into Butch from Fallout 3. Seriously, I included that as a joke in my video. I didn't think he would actually. Overall, this story does a fantastic job of creating that perfect cocktail of camp and horror that you would expect from creepypastas in the late 2000s and early 2010s. Some last bit of praise I'd like to give is that the story does a lot to try and humanize Lou. While I think his characterization is a bit too exaggerated, it's definitely a nice departure from something like the Banning case stories. Like, if you're going to keep Lou around, this is probably the sort of direction that should be taken with him. He essentially plays the same role that characters like Sidney Prescott or Laurie Strode normally fulfill in their respective stories. Alternatively, I wouldn't have minded seeing Randy in this position as well, similar to the Banning case stories, or even a new character entirely, since I'm all for deviating from the mythos of the 2011 story. The last thing that really stuck out to me is the story's version of Old Jeffy Boy. I have both positive and negative things to say regarding it, though overall my thoughts are mostly subjective. In terms of objective criticism, there's two things I need to levy out. The first issue is that I have no idea how the police hasn't caught this goober, but granted that's also an issue with the 2011 version of the character. At the very least, Postra tries to justify this by showing how weaselly this version of Jeff is. So for all I know, this madman could have been living in the fucking sewers or some shit. But this does lead me to a second and much larger issue. This version of Jeff the Killer is a disease-ridden mess. While it's not explicitly stated, it's kind of implied that Postra's Jeff the Killer is suffering from gangrene in his face. And while I'm no doctor, I don't think I need a PhD to realize that this sort of infection would have killed him a while ago. Usually other versions of the character remedy this by explaining that Jeff's unnatural smile is the result of scarring in his face, but this version of Jeff never really had the chance to heal his wounds. Like, when this sort of thing goes untreated, it usually kills someone within about a day or two. This criticism sort of plays into the whole lack of realism complaint I gave earlier, but it needed to be mentioned. So yeah, that's the 2 points of objective criticism that I needed to lay out before I started going into more of the subjective thoughts on Postra's version of Jeffy Boy. I do like how much of a pathetic creature this version of Jeff the Killer is. It's something that hasn't really been attempted yet, and it's a very unique and fresh take on the character. I personally didn't like the voice that Postra went with, given that he's a man in college, but I suppose it's at least a deviation from either Mr. Creepypasta's voice or the Heath Ledger wannabe that people usually do when trying to nail the voice for the character. Something that I really liked about Postra's version of Jeff is that the way he kills his victims plays into his overall design. Since Postra's Jeff is such a feeble creature, the idea of him stalking his victims and waiting for opportunities to strike makes a lot of sense for the character. I personally wouldn't have written Jeff like this, but what I will say is that it fleshes out an element of the character that hasn't really been emphasized until now, which is Jeff's intelligence. I'm aware that a lot of the stories don't really give off this impression since they're horribly written, but Jeff has always been characterized as this cunning animal. He's usually not as intelligent as Postra's version of the character, but he's always been clever. I mean, as stupid as it was, this is the same guy that managed to use his own blood to slip through his bindings in Jeff vs. Jane. Hopefully, future writers try to explore this aspect of his character more in their stories. Overall, that about sums up my thoughts on Postra's Jeff the Killer reboot. I did enjoy it quite a bit, but it's not without its flaws. Although I suppose any story is a tough act to follow when you're being compared against something like the Morgue Files.
My name is Dr. Wilson, and I'm the MD at Pinehearst State Hospital. I've spent 2 decades trying to heal each and every patient in my care. In that time, I've seen the most extraordinary subjects, some with broken minds, others with broken souls.
For those who may have been unaware of this series like myself, The Morgue Files is both a love letter to classic creepypasta and an incredibly dark take on these stories. When you have someone like myself who's been utterly crushed by the mediocrity of modern entertainment, sitting on the edge of their seat like a giddy child, you know you've done a good job. This single video alone puts pretty much any Hollywood attempt at adapting creepypastas to shame. As of the time of writing, I'm in the middle of watching case number 3, but what I've seen so far should be more than enough to cover this story's depiction of Jeff the Killer. Jeffrey Mason is the main villain of case number 2 of the Morgue Files, as well as the primary antagonist of the Pinehearst sessions, which is a mini-series of interview tapes that were made to fill gaps in the story between the first 2 episodes. Throughout the entire story of case number 2, we follow Jeffrey as he slowly transforms from a fucked up teenager into the kind of person that would gut an innocent man and wear them like a coat. The story makes clear from the onset that Jeffrey Mason is a heartless sociopath, and his family spends the majority of the story in denial of both Jeff and Lou's declining mental health until it's too late. The story takes careful steps to leave other characters with warning signs of Jeff's eventual turn, which they either ignore or play down, and Jeff's transformation in general is just incredibly satisfying and well structured. It follows a clear negative arc that you would expect from these sort of villain origin stories, and the payoff of seeing Jeff finally snap is terrifyingly gruesome. One of the distinct elements of this series is that the story is greatly interested in trying to weave many classic creepypastas into one large interconnected universe. While I'd argue that this element of the series hinders the story a bit, it can't be denied that it gives this series a unique charm. After all, seeing my favorite creepypasta monsters like Smile Dog, Zalgo, or Mr. Whitemouth fills me with a level of joy that's almost infectious. Not to mention that the quality of writing on display in the Morgue Files tends to offset any issues that this would otherwise cause, which brings me to my favorite quality about this series. The character writing is without a doubt the series' greatest strength. As much as I love the world building going on in this series, since I'm a geek for that kind of shit, the majority of characters in the Morgue Files have so much raw emotion and humanity that it helps accentuate the monstrosity of characters like Jeffrey Mason, Frank Adams, or Paul of the Rollins Gang. This series has a deep respect for not only the stories it pulls from, but also the audience that grew up alongside these classic creepypastas. Yet at the same time, this series puts a lot of effort in trying to fix the issues present in those original stories, while also introducing incredible characters in their own right, such as Dr. Wilson, Paul of the Rollins Gang, Mr. Crothers, and the Duke Winston. So given all of that, do I think there's places where this series could be improved? Well, yeah, there's always room for improvement. I probably would have liked if this series was just a little less liberal with trying to include as many references to classic creepypastas as it possibly can justify. As of right now, this was only really distracting for me in the first episode, which is a reimagining of Tiki Toby. It's a lot less egregious in Jeff's story, and from what I've seen so far of case number 3, the Candle Cove reference was also pretty tasteful. So, from what I understand, it seems to be a point of criticism that David Neer, the author of these stories, has taken into account. A final point of criticism I'd like to give towards the Morgue Files, at least for the time being, is the current lack of a destination. What I mean by this is that each episode of the Morgue Files is basically set during a further point in the past, which is a damn shame. These stories have done an excellent job of setting the stage for what could only be described as a horror epic, and at some point in this series I would like to eventually see all hell break loose in the town of Forest Lawn, along with a satisfying conclusion to the Morgue Files. Seriously, don't pull a fucking Ruby on me. I need to know how this story ends. So, yeah, that's about all I wanted to talk about in this video. I'm really glad you all pointed out these stories that I had missed in my last essay, and I hope this video clears up any holes left in that project. Again, thank you so much for getting me to 3,000 subscribers, and I'll see you all in the next one.